In Plato's scholarship in the 80s and 90s, the topic of the unity of Plato's thought became hotly debated. At this time, it became rather clear that there were three major or more or less informal schools of interpretations about this specific issue. So, the Unitarists, the Developmentalists, and the Esoteric interpretation. I'm afraid I will have to oversimplify here, but in a nutshell, the Unitarists defend the hypothesis that Plato's work and thought form a consistent whole. The Developmentalists say the contrary and spot contradictions in his work and thought. They try to accommodate these contradictions as signs of the evolution of Plato's philosophy. The esoteric interpretation tackles the same problem in a totally different way. It assumes that the core of Plato's philosophy is merely alluded to in his works. It tries to decipher what Plato's philosophy is from key passages in his works and also from other sources. The Phaedrus and the Republic take a prominent place in this endeavor, along with the lecture on the good, known to us from Aristotle. I am not so much interested in assessing the debate, and probably could not assess that debate, but these three orientations are useful to cast the philosophical problem I wish to address. It is particularly interesting if one is to understand the philosophical relevance of Plato's myth-making. And this specific pair of trivial statements, Plato has a poetic mind and exponent myth, and Plato has a scientific mind and values science over myth. When someone wishes to know what is Plato's philosophy, should this person consider the whole of Plato's philosophy, the whole of Plato's works and its unity, or just pick famous passages and rest assured that they are reliable tokens of Plato's philosophical thought, regardless of the rest? That needs some hermeneutic footwork, or else it is totally arbitrary. Where one should look to outline what is Plato's philosophy? These three interpretations are the main options to answer that question. Let's recall briefly that Parmenides and Heraclitus, Plato's avowed philosophical models, were adamant on the distinction between myth and science, and that Plato himself does not value much rhetoric, poetry, and theater when it comes to knowing anything for certain. In fewer words, Plato might well be a Eleatic and a Pythagorean, but he is also this disciple of Cratylus, who quotes Homer more than any other source. So what are we going to do with this contradiction? So for any type of interpretation, unitarist, developmentalist, and esoteric, it seems impossible to escape the question, what is the intention behind Plato's myth-making? If there is any clear intention. And more fundamentally, how a philosopher is to make sense of Plato's works considered as a whole, if this implies a sturdy vindication of his myths. I think I can show that for Plato, there is a philosophical bonus in using all the means of the language to cover a ground of study, especially when some issues might get out of the reach of purely rational thinking. For this reason, Plato is a rewarding author. He gives much more than one can handle at the same time. Without a minimal representation of the place and purpose of myths in Plato's works, my presentation could be disorienting and discouraging, and my argument would probably come flat. Plato's dialogues are very intricate, and myth-telling pops here and there all the time. What I will propose is a condensed mapping of Plato's works to have an overview of the unity of Plato's works and the place of myths within. The purpose of this is to show that Plato makes a frequent use of myths, although in some typical fashion, noticeable by the time and place where myths are staged in the dialogues. I argue from there that each myth offers a special development stemming from essential aspects of the dialectical debate taking place in one specific dialogue. I will defend that there is a way of showing that Plato's central myths relate to what he calls dialectic and antilogic in a consistent and philosophically interesting way. I will present some examples where the relation is rather straightforward and fruitful, and some places where the connection is harder to find. After that, I will discuss in more detail parts of the myths of the Phaedrus, especially the frenzy of the philosopher, the hireless love, pushing the soul upward, flying posthumous on the top of the sky to have a good time and a bite in the valley of truth. What account of the nature of soul is this? Everything in this myth calls for attention, and it is a serious test case for my interpretation. Our scientific mind could write with such attention and creativity a myth that is so cartoonesque. At the time of writing this line, I'm not sure what will come out of my endeavor. So Plato's works from a developmentalist point of view. To start with the presentation of Plato's work, I will group them into 3 separate periods of his life. I do that not because I think that the developmentalists have it right on the interpretation of Plato's unity works taken as a whole. The main reason for starting with the developmentalists is because this ordering exemplifies one key element of what we think is Socratic dialectic. And this element is where Socrates is the questioner and where it ends in an aporia. So here is the narrative from the side of the developmentalists. Plato started writing Socratic plays with clear aporetic endings. Then, still in the early period, he somehow introduced the theory of forms. This would be the last dialogues we have here in the second part. The Gorgias, the Meno, and the Plotinus. This is the same ordering that I put one slide too much, so this is the real slide. So still in the early period, he somehow introduced the theory of forms in the 3 later dialogues, Gorgias, Meno, and Plotinus. His middle period is when he wrote several dialogues with this philosophical option in mind and arguing for it. So these are the next dialogues: Phaedo, Phaedrus, Phonica, and Symposium. But then he came to a dead end, which would be when he wrote the Parmenides, the refutation or tweaking of the theory of the forms. And anyhow, where his refutation or tweaking, this was the beginning of a new line of thought. So here it is, the late period. So he produced further work, which appear to show more genius in accommodating a revised, more linguistic approach to dialectic. And then I will highlight the place of myth within this ordering. So let's switch. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's highlight where there are myths in this ordering. It is remarkable that with 8 myths on each side, the Socratic period on the one hand and the middle and late period on the other are even in terms of number of myths. So here are the myths and the aporetic dialogues, and here are myths, middle and late period. Of course, you are more familiar with the myths of the middle and late period, much more than the beginning, which are actually here. So in parentheses, you have the myths. So myths are not particularly found in the expository works, but their significance might change when Socrates is a questioner or an answerer in the dialectical setting of the dialogue. So when he is a questioner, there's not so much exposition, but when he is an answerer and uses a myth to answer, that there's a specific weight to the myth because it is expository, so it has some positive content, or we think it must have some positive content. So in an aporetic dialogue, myth is bound to be tentative. So it is not so much a problem. But when Socrates seriously considers philosophical options like the theory of form or the theory of use naturalis and the myths that seem to go with them, it is a big problem if Plato has to retain his scientific mind. Here, a developmentalist might say, Plato is so convinced of his theory that he is also convinced of his own myth-making in the middle period. So this is why the philosopher is also a mythologue. But there are 3 dialogues that are even more troublesome. These three dialogues go further than the Socratic aporetic reserve, but do not show the same amount of philosophical commitment that dialogues of the middle period. With the sound of words, the Gorgias and the Meno are two masterpieces that are hard to place in the ensemble. The Gorgias is a poetic, but pictures the imposition of justice in the afterlife. Does this mean its myth is Platonic, but the dialogue Socratic? Or is this myth particularly Socratic? Look at the Meno now. It is a poetic on what is virtue, so it is Socratic then, but expounds, with the help of a myth, the idea of innate knowledge, which is the main point of Platonic realism. Here again, Plato as a philosopher appears to run straight against Plato as a myth maker. In other words, if Socrates ever believed in these specific myths, then he was not a poetic at all. The definition of virtue is intellectually reachable and justice is natural. These are very robust philosophical positions if they are Socratic. If it only takes a myth to ground them, then the world is truly a wonderful place. So let's focus now on the middle period. It presents a totally different picture than the first period. Good. Yeah. It presents a totally different picture than the first period. Every dialogue is demonstrative, and there is simply no dialogue without a myth. They are all aligned on the theory of form in its more realist version, and their myths expound wild theories about reality, the afterlife, the place of role of gods in the universe, and so on. But the developmentalist ordering might create a distortion because every dialogue of the middle period expounds a myth as a plausible eventuality and expounds the theory of forms in some way or another. This type of classification creates the impression that Plato finally discovered what was his philosophy. So the developmentalist narrative goes, myths expound what the dialectical exchange cannot, or only minimally. That is to say, the definitive Platonic view on truth and the nature of the world, as if Plato became dissatisfied with dialectic and more into myth-making. I am so sorry to say that I am, for my part, totally dissatisfied by this type of narrative, pushing forward a historical reconstruction of unknown facts as the solution of a philosophical problem. It leaves untouched the dyad of Plato as a rational thinker and Plato as a myth maker, and hides it under the cloak of Plato's phenomenology of spirit. When Plato became Plato, he found in myths what his rational thinking could not expose to dialectic. If one wants, like I do, to salvage Plato from this awkward posture, it requires a positive explanation about the rationality behind myth-making. Now, this is what I would like to propose as some case examples of the interplay between the dialectical exchanges and the myth in the Platonic dialogue. By the means of a comparison between the myth of the Gorgias and the myth of the Meno, I think I can explain what is so special with the myth of the Meno. So first consider the Gorgias. Socrates wins the argument against Polos and then against Callicles on the very odd premise that it is better to suffer from wrongdoing than being unjust and not charged. Socrates asserts that his thesis has never been refuted, and in front of the angry Callicles, he is left alone talking. At this point, I suggest that he starts with the premise that it is better to suffer from wrongdoing than being unjust and not charged. This means that justice is natural in some way, because it applies in every case. Being just is better than the contrary, whatever one might endure. Either you side with Socrates and recognize that being unjust is worse than anything else, or you disregard justice and say you are better off with Callicles and Polus. But this last option is closed because Polus and Callicles have been refuted. So we are back with Socrates, saying that in any case, we are better off suffering from an injustice than committing one. This calls for an explanation. If you state that any unrefuted thesis is true, as long as it has not been refuted, then this thesis must be true for some very strong reason. After all has been said in a dialectical fashion, how one is to explain why this is so. Why, whatever humans do to one another, justice is real. This is where the myth kicks in. It explains what is the picture of a world where justice is natural. I mean by that that justice is unescapable. It is at the foundation of the organization of things. If one agrees with Polus and Callicles that one can do something unjust and be better off, the lesson is that he might be better off during his life, but since justice is natural, he will have to suffer much longer in the afterlife. Let's now focus on the Meno. In his exchange with Meno, Socrates corners him and presses him to give a definitive definition of virtue. Meno pushes back with a paradox, which is not really new since it is already in Sophocles. How can one know he found what he is looking for if he doesn't know what he's looking for? This is the famous paradox of research. To that, Socrates counters first with a myth and then with a dialectical demonstration. What the myth says, it says that the soul is immortal, and this explains why knowledge is innate. Before incarnation, the soul contemplates the pure and barren truth. When it is in a human body, the soul loses touch with the truth, but it can recall some part of it. So discovering something is a process of anamnesis, namely to recall what the soul had seen before it was incarnated. Then Socrates supports this thesis of innate knowledge with a dialectical demonstration. He shows that properly led, a young slave could come to understand that the double surface of any square is obtained by squaring its diagonal. That is 2a square equals b square, where a is the side of the square and b its diagonal, for the ones who can remember the demonstration. What is interesting here is that we have the reverse ordering of the Gorgias. The myth of the Gorgias is eschatological. It comes as a conclusion, pushing further Socrates' thesis that justice is not just a matter of human relationships and conventions, but is natural in some strong way. The hypothetical aspect of such a myth is rather clear. When all is said and done through dialectic, one can still speculate on the nature of the world. The Meno places the myth before the dialectical demonstration, and this creates another effect on the reader than what is achieved by an eschatological myth. This order of presentation leaves the clear impression that what the myth says is confirmed through a rational demonstration. It seems that Socrates believes what the priests and priestesses say about transmigration of the soul because he can lead a slave to discover some truth about geometry without previously knowing what it is. A second element lends even more credence to the myth of the Meno, because it expounds a key element of Plato's theory of forms, that the human soul has the natural capacity of grasping these forms, which are true, real, and eternal. The theory of innate knowledge is the psychological side of the philosophical thesis that forms are real. So if Plato is an advocate of the theory of forms, he should believe in this particular myth of the Meno. I have no idea about Plato's beliefs because Plato is a writer of play and never wrote anything in his own words, in his own name. But based on what we have seen in the Gorgias and the Meno, we have a clearer picture of how myths and dialectic respond to one another in the course of a dialogue. Regardless of the fact that one myth is eschatological on justice and the other expository on innate knowledge, we are able to see that the myth offers a poetic expansion of what is discussed in the dialectical exchange. In this sense, the myth of the Meno is like the one in the Gorgias. Both the Gorgias and the Meno show that the myth is a speculation on the form of a poetic creation stemming from the specific thesis that has been championed by Socrates. My hypothesis is that the more positive myths in Plato have this relation with the dialectical arguments. If one reflects on the myths belonging to the middle period of Plato's philosophical career, it is possible to see that the dialectical discussions always relate on the hypothesis of the theory of forms in its first version, while the myths present a mental image of what the world should like if Socrates' main hypothesis was true. The eternal life of the soul, natural justice and beauty, the reality of the numbers, reality of the forms, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Where is something here? So, yeah, this problem. Yeah. So, so some interpretation of the Phaedo and the Republic, just to see how I would interpret those myths. So the Phaedo presents a physical depiction of the world to explain where the souls go when detached from the body. This is linked with Socrates' hypothesis that the soul is immortal. Here, Plato avails himself of a rather conservative conception of the soul that makes it humid and volatile. He might also have thought of the clouds and its cosmology based on the circulation of air. This is some ironic way of closing the circle of Socrates' public life. And the Republic ends with a myth similar to the one found in the Gorgias. The logic of this dialogue is the same than in the Gorgias. It depicts a world in which justice is natural. And it also replies to the opening myth of Gyges' magical ring presented by Glaucon in the beginning of Book 2. From there, I move to the Phaedrus. This is the planet Phaedrus. So the myth of the Phaedrus is more difficult to square with my hypothesis. At least it requires more hermeneutical footwork. Some elements are typical of the middle period. The three-part psychology of the chariot, the valley of the truth, the celestial hierarchy of the good and bad souls, the transmigration of the souls, all this resonates with the myths found in the Meno, the Gorgias, the Republic, and the Phaedo. But if I am to follow my proposal, this specific poetic expansion should be in close relation with the argument of the Phaedrus. And the specific way in which the myth dovetails with the dialectical argument should tell us something about the Phaedrus and the fundamental assumptions of Plato's philosophy. So now, this is very problematic because if we are to believe the myth of the Phaedrus, the philosopher is mentally insane. Eros reigns above the material as well as in the intellectual world, and the best we can do is to follow where our innate madness is driving us. For rationalistic thinkers like Socrates and Plato, this is hard to fit in the broader picture of dialectical training, refutations, and finding the elements of science based on a clear-headed common agreement. What is more, the myth is placed at the beginning of the dialogue, which has a second part dedicated to the values of rhetoric versus dialectic, of written speech versus unwritten speech. The second part of the dialogue on speech is clearly the consequence of the first part on love. So in the Phaedrus, the myth is a preparation of sorts for philosophy. It is exactly the reverse of the usual order in Plato's dialogues, where mythical speech usually comes after the dialectical exchanges. So the short presentation of the structure of the Phaedrus, we have the prologue, and then the first part on love, which is a three-part first part. Lysias' speech, it is better to be loved by someone who doesn't love you. Socrates' critique of Lysias in his first speech. This is the same thesis as Lysias, but in other words, other better sounding words. And then we have Socrates' critique of his own first speech, a second speech, which is the Palinody contra Lysias and himself. So this is the myth on divine madness and the soul. And then we have the second part of speech. First, we have first critique of writing, which is pictured as an art of persuasion based on appearances. Then the review of the previous speeches, a short section on the two types of madness that have been exposed in the myth. Then on rhetoric and science, what are the science? What are the sciences that are useful for rhetoric? Sorry, and then second critique of writing as a tool for memory, which is not allowed, and then a prayer and farewell. I think the point of connection between the myth and the argument of the Phaedrus is the question of human irrationality, and especially its relation with love and erotic discourses. Let's recall how the argument unfolds. The argument stands out, the Phaedrus stands out as a unique kind of dialectical development in the whole of Plato's oeuvre, mainly because Socrates is refuting a text and engages with it not only once, but twice. So I present a summary of the portion that leads to the myth, and I hope this can explain what is the purpose of the myth in the first part. So in Lysias' speech, it is said that lovers are rather sick than moderate. They know they cannot think straight, but they are incapable of mastering themselves. Socrates is entirely dissatisfied with Lysias' speech. He says to Phaedrus that old and wise men and women like Sappho and Anacreon will refute Socrates if he says he agrees with it. But Socrates and Phaedrus agree on one thing. How could someone argue against moderation and not blame the person deprived of reason? Socrates and Phaedrus, they take this as a sound hypothesis. So we have the specific verb, hypothetestai. So Socrates needs to talk with his sound mind. He is forced to talk by Phaedrus, who is quite imperative, even upset with Socrates' reluctance to speak. Therefore, Socrates will speak, but he will speak against his own heart and mind, with his head covered by his cloak, for he is ashamed of what he's going to say. During his first speech, he draws a distinction between sophrosune and hubris based on the power of the logos. Of course, sophrosune is better than hubris. And this distinction between sophrosune and hubris anticipates the two horses image in the chariot. Moments after, Socrates states that the sick lover hates what is equal or better than him. So he will keep his lover, his beloved, away from divine philosophy. While Phaedrus is very enthusiastic with Socrates' speech, Socrates is not happy with his own speech. His discourse and Lysias are impious. Thus Socrates does a volte-face. Eros is a god and should be honored as such. As a consequence, he must offer a palinody, an extended counterpoint to his speech, or a B-side, if you will, that ought to correct his kategoria about Eros, his vilification of the god, with a eulogy of love. Socrates will then speak his head uncovered. He retracts the previous hypothesis that being madly in love is bad, because there are positive forms of madness. This is where the myth takes its root. It starts with a review of different forms of divine madness, telling the future, the oracles, and poetry. And this leads Socrates to a quite imaginative depiction of the nature of the soul. You all know what it is. The soul is compared to a winged chariot with a bad and a good horse and a charioteer. This picks up the distinction between hubris and sophrosune seen above. The hubristic horse and the sophron horse are the black and white horses. The intellect, the charioteer, has to master both in order to keep its course. He will always be tempted by hubris, but must rein it in if he doesn't want to die in a chariot crash, or rather in a flying chariot crash, which is probably much more deadly. According to the central part of the myth, the soul is nurtured by Eros. When possessed by Eros, the soul grows its wing, and the bigger the love, the bigger the wings. So there is not a complete contradiction between Eros and reason. If Eros is seen as a source of inspiration ranging from the lowest to the highest forms of love. The love of divine philosophy is reintroduced into the mix of the passionate life as the highest form of inspiration, leading the soul to the highest places in the world. So this is the valley of truth, or the very roof of the universe. We can all see how this connects with Socrates' previous speech. The myth gives a mental image of the soul. If we are to start with the hypothesis that love and reason are not opposed to one another. This in itself is based on the assumption that there is something like a divine inspiration at play, even in the most rational forms of intellectual life. So the myth is clearly a device to explain what are the consequences of the hypothesis that there are rational types of desires. So without any surprise, philosophy is the rational desire par excellence, the rational desire par excellence. The lesson of the Phaedrus now. I lack time to explain that we can deduce from this interpretation. But in few words, I think that Phaedrus offers a unique view into Plato's conception of writing. Right at the beginning of the Phaedrus, Socrates rejects the rationalistic explanations of myths as cumbersome and vulgar. These people, these sophoi, he says, try to give reasons to explain why the myths are materially and rationally true. As for Socrates himself, he does not have the time to indulge into such endeavors, for he cannot even know himself. And he says, when he thinks about myths, he tries to know himself, not to know if they are true. And I guess this is more or less what Plato would say about his own myth making. He's not making them up because they might be rationally true or empirically true, or he doesn't care about really the rationalist interpretation or material interpretation of his myths. It is a way of picturing what he's thinking of, what he's doing, about what he's doing. And especially in the Phaedrus, the myth of the Phaedrus would be what it is to write philosophy and what, from where the inspiration of writing philosophy and spending his whole life into philosophy is coming. So this is a trend I would like to follow. If the second part of the Phaedrus has to do anything with the myth of the first part, it is rooted in the basic assumption that writing can have an influence on the soul. This is something Lysias or any rhetorician who is also a logograph wishes dearly. And this is something Plato must also wish if his writing has to have any purpose. So this very question of the inspiration to writing raises the question of the desire behind a book, or the desire that the book can convey. As it is said in the Phaedrus, one cannot be a good rhetorician if he does not have a knowledge of the soul of the people he's talking to. So there is a close link between the nature of the soul and speech writing. And it is precisely the types of desires that drives one's soul upward or downward that makes the link between the speechwriter and its audience. One reason Socrates does not like his first speech is because it is not inspired at all. It is rational through and through, but it lacks the sparkle of an imagination that can explain what is good in love. I think this could explain Socrates' criticism about written speech. It is hard to see how any kind of writing could convey the type of divine inspiration Socrates associates with philosophy. Maybe Plato thought that a carefully balanced mix of dialectic and myth-telling was the best way to do it. But at least Socrates and Phaedrus can hold on to something. The myth of the winged chariot is the best possible explanation of what force pushes the soul to pursue the philosophical life. It is the highest kind of desire, the desire for knowledge, but still a desire, not entirely rational as any other kind of desire. So I think all this, what I've said about Plato and myth making and the solution I tried to offer of the link between dialectic and the form of the dialogue and the myths within the dialogues. I think first, this is not I'm not trying to explain the whole of Plato's philosophy with that or the unity of his work. I think it's more a tool to understand how each dialogue is using myths and how Plato would be interested in myth making while writing every of his dialogue. But the other point I would like to make as a conclusion is that this sort of reflection is at the core of philosophical problems in general. It's not just Plato's interpretation, but I think it is a philosophical problem. This problem is what is philosophy in itself? And if philosophy is to be seen as one of the sciences or a rational endeavor, then it's hard to see what is specific with philosophy. Maybe it could be dissolved into various regional sciences. If philosophy has to be the general type of reasoning that it is, then it should encompass rational thinking in science, but also topics that are not purely rational. And the soul is one topic that is not purely rational. Because, well, as Plato thinks, and as we see every day, the soul has irrational desires and is moved by things that we cannot really understand, purely understand or clearly understand. And there are other topics in the soul that philosopher could be interested in, like poetry, the arts, and other techniques like rhetoric. And I hope to have shown that for Plato, doing philosophy is to extend the use of language and the use of reason further than just science and rational thinking, in order to try to understand every phenomenon of the human mind. And therefore, myth telling could be useful in explaining what will happen when we go further than the boundaries of rational thinking. And so dialectical thinking, and what happens in the dialogues, and what happens in science, if you see it as a dialectical exchange, is very limited as a type of demonstration, because the bar is very high. It's very high. It's very hard to clear the bar of rational thinking if you think that rational thinking is dialectical exchange, because it's very easy to refute. The place of the answer is harder to fit in than the place of the questioner. So if you're Plato, you cannot demonstrate many things with dialectic. You can say, well, these are my best hypotheses. I might stick with this thesis that we need forms, or that there are eternal forms, or that the world is a perfect whole. These are hypotheses that you can consider through dialectic, and you might need in order to do dialectic. But this will only bring you as far as you are grounding dialectic with some hypothesis. But this is not, you won't go very far with this. So if the philosopher is interested in other in grounding knowledge, then empirical knowledge and empirical demonstrations, or the original sciences, are not what you're interested in. You're interested in the hypotheses that are grounding all those sciences. And of course, these hypotheses are really hard to verify. So you're stuck with your dialectical hypothesis and your dialectical training and your dialectical exercises. So I guess this is very unsatisfactory if you want to understand what reality is. So there's a very clear temptation to have a poetic expansion that would just take the hypothesis for granted, the thesis for granted, and explain what the world would be like, without the dialectical exchange with the myth, because any dialectical exchange in the myth would just ruin the myth. So I guess this is what I wanted to say with this talk. For philosophers, you cannot disregard the fact that language is a tool that will bring you further than rational thinking, and maybe could place some furniture in the room of reality, if you don't want to just say that you're alone in your world. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that immensely stimulating talk. So if I could just start the discussion by bringing up a very broad brush perspective to see if I've understood your account of the relationship between logos and mythos in Plato. You might take two paradigms of how rationality and mythology dash symbolism relate to each other, for broadly speaking, the imagination in 19th century philosophy, in terms of Hegel and Schelling. So where
Yeah.
you know, for Hegel, it's clear that the Vorstellung or the imagination or the realm of images have to be translated into the Begriff. That's what philosophy is doing, and his whole theory of religion and his account of the relationship between religion, art, and philosophy is based on that, as it were, translation. And of course, the Schelling of the late philosophy of the Philosophie de Mythologie would be in a way a counter to that there's an irreducible element to the symbolic dash imaginary dash mythic that the concept cannot grasp, that in a sense transcends the conceptual. That das Vordenkliche is what he talks about, to the pre-conceptual, in a sense is superior. So are you suggesting, and again, forgive me for the rather crass paradigms here, but are you suggesting that Plato is in a way, some way between those, the anachronistic paradigms, between those two extremes, that in a sense, it's a tension between logos and mythos that we have here, rather than a subordination of one to the other?
I guess what I'm trying to say is that trying to put dialectic and myth in a hierarchy would not be a good way of looking at Plato.
Yep.
I don't think what people have done that.
Whichever way,
dialectic above or myth above. And you start with the opposition between logos and mythos.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's this way. Logos is this complete whole, and into logos you have a clear distinction between dialectic, which is back and forth question and answer, and long speech dash myth telling.
Yeah.
And these are a common endeavor to work on hypotheses or premises that are expounded in the dialogue. So see in the Gorgias the hypothesis that it is better to suffer from injustice and so on and so forth is behind the idea of natural justice. And so the myth is there to give a mental representation of what would be the world if this thesis was true. So I don't know how to explain that. It's rather at the time Plato was writing, it was very bold to introduce myth into philosophy, because Thucydides started a history without myth. Plato is an heir of the sophists, whether you say he would agree with that, but he still, he's a man of science. He's clearly a man of science, but the question is why introducing myths? I guess it's more or less like what Parmenides did in his poem. The central part of the poem is dedicated to the description of a world that is unique and perfect and that doesn't know time or that does not have place for place. They are very, very bad paradoxical words. And the last part is dedicated to explanation of the physical world with some contradictions. So you have the middle part where contradiction is not permitted in Parmenides' poem, and the last part where contradictions are everywhere. And those contradictions can explain the movement of the world, the difference between night and day, and matter and fire, and so on and so forth. I guess Plato is doing the same. He has two tools, which is dialectic and myth making, and they are precisely what the other is not. Dialectic cannot work with contradictions. Myth is full of them, and there is no middle ground between. There's no middle ground between dialectic and myth. But myth will give you what dialectic cannot. So myth will give you what we see in the Phaedrus, some sort of inspiration of what the world could be or would be if your thesis was true. So
would narrative be a mediating principle here? So I mean, you
yeah, well, my idea is that to grasp Plato's philosophical thinking, you need to be hermeneutes. You need to interpret Plato's philosophy, and the first thing you have in front of you is separate dialogues. So you need to go through the separate dialogues and understand each dialogue in its own setting, and try from there to induce what is Plato's philosophy. So I'm not ready to make this step and say what Plato's philosophy is, but I think I can explain how each dialogue works when there's a myth with it. And some myths are more related to the hypothesis. Some myths are not related at all, like in the Charmides. Socrates starts with a myth of Zalmoxis, the god, and he said that in order to cure someone, you need to cure the head first and the body second. So this is clearly a lure to have discussion about Charmides. And this doesn't have so much link with the thesis that is the Charmides, but in the Republic and in the Gorgias, it's clearly linked with the hypothesis. So in each dialogue, you have the myth has a definite purpose, which is probably different than the use of the myth in another dialogue. But the idea is, and what you said is what I think, is that you construct the narrative, and you need to understand the narrative of each dialogue. So the title of my talk could have been "Plato is a writer of plays." He writes plays, and in these plays there are dialogues, bits of dialogues and bits of myth. And in each dialogue, they form a consistent whole. And this consistent whole is the effect of having one's thought exercised into rational thinking, and then while relaxing the constraints of logic, having a picture of the world that is satisfactory for the imagination and the poetic side of your soul. So then you have a complete piece of philosophy that could lead you upwards if we take the analogy of the Phaedrus.
Thank you. First, Kirby.
Thank you for that really interesting analysis. I was wondering where the Timaeus might fit into this discussion, the ikos muthos that appears there.
Well, I'm very grateful for you to come with this question. I did my PhD with Luc Brisson, and he worked a lot on Timaeus, and so I was very interested from the start of my own career about the ikos muthos, and what I would say is that you see, the myth of the Timaeus is it's an explanatory tool to reach a goal. The goal is to explain the composition of the world.
Yeah.
So what is the world? And one explanatory tool is the idea of a maker. In order to explain what is something, you can explain how something is made. And when you have explained how something is made, then you understand the result.
The demiurgos.
So the demiurgos is there as a explanatory tool. So it's a myth. It's a product of imagination.
What does eikos add to muthos, I wonder?
Sorry?
Eikos muthos. I mean, it's not just a muthos, it's a likely muthos.
Yeah, ICOS is well the origin meaning of ICOS is according to it means according to the manners or following regular manners.
Yeah.
So we tend to stretch that towards verisimilitude or but
Icon.
yeah. Well, it seems to be it's a mood that is likely. That's how we translate that. I'm not sure it's the best translation because it introduces a contradiction between. It might say that mythos is unlikely, and then we do a likely myth, which would be something that doesn't have really meaning. So,
but there's some kind of uncertainty there.
In the mythos,
yeah,
of course, it is totally. I think Timaeus is clear on many occasions in his speech. He says, if someone comes up with a better interpretation or better theory, then he will be my friend. So I think he's aware that it is all tentative, but the mythos is helpful, or even like I don't know what would be the best word for that, according to the manners, or reasonable.
Yeah.
Plausible? Yeah, not plausible. It's reasonable to use. It's reasonable to come with a myth. Okay. It's not unreasonable.
Acceptable.
Or acceptable. Yeah.
I have a supplementary, if I may.
But I'm just want to go on with the Timaeus.
Yeah.
So this is another use of the myth, which is different from all the other dialogues.
Yeah.
And this use of the myth is to come with the better possible explanation that you have in order to reach a goal, which is to understand the composition of the universe. So in order to understand a complex whole, you need to understand how the pieces are put together. And in order to show how the pieces are put together, you come with the hypothesis of a maker. And then with your maker, you can understand what is the hierarchy of things and how things relate to one another and how they work with one another. And then when you're done, the Demiurgos, you say ciao to the Demiurgos, which is exactly what Timaeus says. He says, well, then when the world is made, the Demiurgos went to his holidays.
So you have the Demiurgos is the Logos principle in the Timaeus narrative?
No, the Logos principle is the
paradigm,
the soul of the world.
Ah.
Yeah.
Where does the hupodoke?
Which is the Torah. Yeah. What is?
Well, I'm just wondering that there's this irrational, chaotic thing.
Yeah. Well, the hupodoke and the forms, you'll notice that they are never they are separate in the narrative of the Demiurgos. So if you use the narrative of Demiurgos, you have this Demiurgos, this artisan that comes into a place where there's chaos, some stuff, indefinite stuff, and then he has a will, which is a good will. He will create the best possible creature with this. So he takes the best paradigma, which are the forms, and creates the world, and out with the exit the Demiurgos. So,
but the hupodoke is not hule. It's not matter, is it?
Sorry?
I say this receptacle principle is not a principle of unformed matter.
This is a discussion that there is in Plutarch. Either you say hule is different from hupodoke or not. So hupodoke is, what I mean here is that you will never find Cora without any form in the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Barren Cora is not existent. Barren Cora is a principle used in order to explain what the world is made of. The world is made of matter. This matter is not totally and purely ordered. There is some chaos behind. So you might do the same experiment and come with different results. And this is some principle of uncertainty in the physical world. So the Cora is there to explain that uncertainty with matter.
And Cora is also womb, I think.
The womb is another word, but it is the Cora is compared to the womb.
Okay,
in the
so
Timaeus.
that's a kind of poetical.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not sure it's the womb. It might also be the what is attached to the womb and
Placenta?
the placenta.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
because
this
if you see a placenta,
there's an
it has
icon
no form at all,
in
and it's very blobby and all that, and the baby comes out of the placenta, or it's linked to the placenta. So actually, the baby in the womb is the world. The placenta is the matter that gives life to the womb, that nurtures the womb. And well, of course, the sperm is the form, other forms.
in Saint Savior and Cora in Constantinople, as I prefer to call it. There is a beautiful mosaic in the vestibule, the inscription of which is He Cora tu akoretu, which is in the guidebook at least translated the womb of the unwombable, and it's a depiction of Mary with Christ in her belly.
Oh, yeah, it might. Well, my interpretation of the placenta is unique.
Okay.
I don't know anyone who's come with it, but if you think that the womb is the Cora, then you have a problem, because in fact, what is written in Timaeus is that you need three elements, and the womb, or the baby in the middle, is the result of the two first. So it's hard to picture how it
Is it the equivalent of Aristotle's dunamis? Is it a pure potentiality, or?
Yeah, so that's it. So the placenta is pure potentiality. Anything could come out of it, and so cold and hot, or a baby girl or baby boy.
Perhaps if we could move on from anti-gynecology to
That'd be happy.
Do you think there's possibly some analogy between sort of mythical exposition and dialogical exchange?
Analogy between mythical explanation.
Between myth and dialogue and form and matter, in the sense that possibly more in an Aristotelian sense, in say where you seem to be explaining that both are necessary for.
Well,
and more in the sense of, you know, the sort of analogy of the statue, you require that you know, the marble that you chip away, and you know, I'm imagining sort of form in the sense of you know, your well, I don't know which way around really would be, but you have the myth as the substance, and you chip away through dialogue, but you need these hypotheses, you need this concept.
I would say that Plato is seen as a disciple of Cratinus, and we think that, well, the reason for that is that he wrote the Critias, the dialogue. Sorry,
Pythagoras, you said that. Sorry, I just didn't hear you.
Pythagoras, but also Cratinus. Both of them. Cratylus.
Cratylus.
Okay,
sorry. Yes,
Cratylus. Yeah. So he's a disciple of Cratylus.
Yeah.
And
I remember once sitting in a lecture in France, thinking, who on earth is Empédocle?
Empédocles.
Empedocles.
I guess language would be the matter. And every form of language, Plato is interested in every form of language. We have every possible example of the types of language in his dialogues, from the more narrative to the very strictly dialectical. And what he does is that what I think he does is that he is interested in seeing what is true in every form of dialogue. So there's an idea of recycling the myths that are going around and trying to decipher what people were trying to picture through myths. What is the type of world the myths are conveying? So the dialectical exchange is refining the hypothesis. So through the dialectical exchange, you come up with plausible hypothesis and less plausible hypothesis. Then you purify them because you play the game much more than what the dialogues would show. You play the game all the day, and in the end of the day, you think, well, actually, friendship would be common love for a highest good. Okay, good. So you write a dialogue with this in mind, placing two opponents. And then when you've done with the best possible refutation of your thesis, you place a myth at the end that would retract the rational criterion of dialectic and explain the view of the world. So they are both actually, language is a matter that is constructed. Well, a dialogue uses all the principles of matter, but I say there are dialogues that Plato, you see, sometimes dialogues are not that close to Plato's interpretation or to Plato's philosophy.
One question from Daniele and then Chiara and
is it all right if
in what sense? The last sense?
well, you see at the beginning of the Charmides, Socrates says, well, someone told me about Zalmoxis, which is a priest, and this priest said that in order to cure the body, you have to cure the head first, right? And so many people think, well, if you think that Plato thought that, then his view of medicine is very strange. All right. So it's a rhetorical device to have a young boy interested in having a dialectical exchange with Socrates. So this is not very informed by the theory of forms or any type of philosophy of Plato. The same with the divine inspiration of the poet in the Ion. So the poet is like a magnetic like an iron stone stuck on the magnetic field of the god. Did really Plato think that we had some magnetic intuition linking us with the god, and that poetry is true and true a magnetic inspiration? It's hard to know, okay? But the idea of a pure world, perfect world with circles and all this perfection, saying that the world is wonderful and is the model for humans and for every type of art the humans do, then I think it would be closer to Plato. So the fact that some myths are not clearly Platonic I would disagree on this.
So he's more like a sculptor using myths to arrive at.
Yeah, it's populating his plays with sculptures, and some are very clearly inspired by his own hypothesis. Some others are just characters passing by.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your speech. And I was impressed by what you said. Namely the link between contradictions and myth making. Okay. But I was thinking that there's a dialogue that is full of contradictions, but without an actual myth in it. It's only dialectic, and that is to say the Parmenides.
Yep.
Okay. So from your point of view, how do you explain the Parmenides case in the Platonic literary production? And do you think the Parmenides is the failure of dialectic? I don't think so, honestly. Okay. I don't know how you explain that.
Okay.
From Joe.
So according to the division of the developmentalists, there are three dialogues in the late period that do not have any myth, which is the Sophists, the Parmenides, and the Theaetetus. These are very positive and constructive dialogues that have no myth at all, or very small pieces in there in the Sophists and the Theaetetus, but not anything compared to the Phaedo or the Phaedrus. It shows that Plato can do philosophy without recourse to any myth-telling. And so it shows that my interpretation of Plato about myth-telling is limited to myth-making in Plato. But don't think that I'm explaining what is the whole of philosophy or dialectical training of thinking in Plato. I think the Parmenides is Plato's how can I say, Plato's best example of what is dialectic. And so he has a narrative first, and then an example at the second part. The example of dialectic gymnastic is the second part. So you take a hypothesis, the one, and you divide it into specific hypotheses that it is and that it is not, which are and then you divide it in other hypotheses that it is, but it is not anything else, that it is and it is everything, and so on and so forth. So this is it is a testimony that at Plato's time, dialectic was still en vogue, or was still played, and that people were looking for models of what was dialectic. So this treatise is a good example of what is dialectic. The first part, the narrative part, is a thoroughly philosophical reflection of what you need to do dialectic and what is dialectic, and what it is on its assumptions. So he frames the dialogue with Zeno and Parmenides, and then Socrates. And Zeno and Parmenides are experienced dialectical fighters, and they have a specific relation between their hypotheses. The Parmenides hypothesis is that being is one, and Zeno's hypothesis is that multitude is absurd. And Socrates jumps on the relation between both, and he says, well, actually, so Zeno, you demonstrated that Parmenides is right. If you say that multitude is absurd and Parmenides says that being is one, then you're saying basically that Parmenides is right. And Zeno corrects him. Zeno says, well, no, I've just shown that if Parmenides' theory is strange, that everything is one, that being is one, I've shown that the people that are arguing against Parmenides are more absurd, and that it will lead them into greater contradictions than the contradiction that are stemming from Parmenides' theory. And this is a very important point about dialectic, is that you can refute one theory and refute the opposite theory, and you can be sure that you have good refutations, and then what are you doing from that point on? If you refute A and refute B, and A and B are contradictory to one another, then you're left with nothing. So you can, and if you assess A and you refute the contrary of A, it doesn't mean that you are giving grounds to believe that A is good. This is a basic point of logic.
This is in Euclid, reductio was thought to be the more sure argument, isn't it?
Yeah, but this works in geometry.
Okay.
It might not work in philosophy,
Okay.
right?
I thought we were heading in the direction of reductio in what you were saying there. Is it-
Yeah. Well, that's precisely what Zeno says.
Yeah.
Is that my position is not a reductio ad absurdum of
Okay.
Parmenides' thesis,
Okay.
because Parmenides' thesis leads to contradiction.
Okay.
So if you have a thesis that leads to contradiction, it's not because the opposite of this theory that leads also to contradiction that you're done with the contradiction of the first position.
Excuse my interruption.
No, it's all right, it's all right. So Socrates says, oh, wow, yeah, all right. And then you have the second part of the first part of the Parmenides, which is on the forms. And it's very interesting because it's a refutation of the theory of the forms. That's how people stress that. But most people don't see that there's a positive, or rather another part of the refutation of the forms at the end of what Parmenides says. And Parmenides says, well, actually, all of this is good. You can refute the forms and say that it will lead you into some absurd grounds and all that, but we cannot do anything without the forms if we want to do dialectic. So it's very interesting to see Parmenides that lines up reasons to believe that the forms is not a good theory, but says that we cannot do anything without the forms. And you see, you have a Parmenides there that argues pro and contra. And then he does the same with the one. He argues pro that the one is, and contra that the one is not. So to summarize what I'm saying is that Plato needed a picture of what complete dialectic would be. And this is a picture of what is a complete dialectical examination. Is that if you want to do a complete dialectical examination, you need to argue pro and contra several times in a row. And this is not what Socrates is doing. He never has the time to do that. So he always argue pro a thesis and not contra this thesis. And you see it's the same in the Phaedrus. In the Phaedrus, he argues that this first speech, he says, like Lysias, that it is better to be loved by someone who doesn't love you. And Phaedrus says, yes, but what are you doing with the person who loves you? Or the contrary of your thesis. He said, I have no time for that. So Socrates is not the master dialectician. The master dialectician is Parmenides. And Socrates sometimes refers to that dialectician. He says, it would take a long time, to review the hypothesis and every branch of it. So
last but not least, Chiara.
Thank you very much for that. My question is, and forgive me if this is a main question, but given we're talking about texts that are recounting narratives, presenting these narratives versus, characters discussing, how comfortable or what kind of tools can we use to identify what is actually myth, in as much as these are fictitious narratives of a young slave boy, kind of where do we identify myth versus
Would you mean that every dialogue is a myth in itself?
Well, how do we know when the myth actually, if we're kind of trying to use this hermeneutic to understand the role of myth, where does the myth start and where does it end? And how do we is there something that through all the myths that we've identified in each of the dialogues, is there a common character that we can say, the gods are invoked here, so this is myth, in comparison to say, the slave boy is here and this is myth, or I'm taking off my hood, and that's actually something that seems to be a narrative tool or a kind of context scene setting moment that in the dialogue. I understand.
I understand your question. Well, First, at the broader level of Plato's dialogues. Plato's dialogues are a tragedy. They are the tragedy of Socrates' life and death. There are some of the dialogues that fit in here and there, but most of Plato's dialogues are to be seen as a tragedy. And within these tragedies, you have bits of dialectical exchanges that are clearly marked as dialectical exchanges. So as my answer could be negative and say, well, the myth is all the rest. The dialectical exchange is, well, do you agree to answer to my questions? Yes, so let's go on. Do you think that? And then whenever you have that, or let's say yes and no, say yes and no to what I'm telling you. So sometimes, someone's trying to take the dialectical exchange towards myth, and Socrates is always there saying, no, I don't want lengthy speeches. I don't have a good memory for that. Answer my question. So these are markers that show when dialectic is starting. The rest is a story, of course, and the rest are imaginative characters that are the produce of Plato's imagination. So yes, it's all the myth, but see that it's a precise myth, it's a tragedy. So there's always in the dialogue a place where Socrates will show his own character and see that he's dissatisfied with something, or he's talking with boys that are way too young for his age and things like that. So this uses the tragedy thread. The myth thread is clearly when you have legatai, people say that, or old and wise people say that, or common people will tell you that.
Aristotle uses that a lot.
Yeah, so you have this even eikos mutos. The eikos mutos, the probable myth. The eikos means that people use that explanation a lot, So it's logic that I will use it for this type of explanation, but it's very variegated. You have many ways of introducing a myth and going out. I think there are some typical things, eschatological myth at the end, or when someone is tired of hearing Socrates is starting speaking, so you will always have recourse to myth. But myths comes in very many shapes and forms. So it's really the fine art of Plato's writing that can introduce the myth into his own dialogue. So yes, it's clear where dialectic ends and starts, and not clear where the myth ends on.
Forgive me for abusing my position in the chair, but if I could just add a question to that. So that was extremely interesting what you were saying about tragedy. But in the symposium, for example, and for other dialogues, you could think of it, there's clearly a comic element as well as the tragic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, see, it's a tragedy because Socrates is going to die.
Mm.
And it's a tragedy because you're supposed to weep when Socrates is dying. So it's sad that Socrates has to die. But Socrates was put to death for a specific reason. Is that people thought he was ridiculed and he was stupid, and he wasn't a good citizen. He was laughing about everything. He wasn't serious about anything that people thought he was serious. So the character Socrates, the character is comical. He is in himself someone laughable.
Does the charge of atheism figure in this account of where the mythical applies to him?
Yeah, well, that's what makes that. This is something, the myth making everywhere in Plato, or the myth telling everywhere in Plato, and Socrates telling myths over myths, makes it very implausible that he was totally atheist.
Indeed.
If it meant anything to be atheist at his time,
Yeah.
So I don't think that this was the right reason, or the real reason why he was put to death is not that he was talking about the gods in a different way that everyone else was doing. Is that he was putting a shame the people he was talking to, and he wasn't taking as serious the matters people were taking, that the serious matters people were discussing. So he wasn't that serious about politics, about money, about the things that made the very fabric of Athenian democracy.
Well, perhaps this is the moment to thank our speaker for giving us such a wonderful and stimulating talk and conversation. So
thank you for coming.
Very much.